So here's how gun control debates go in America. Mass shooting happens. The advocates of gun control cries out for more regulations, more laws, possibly downright ban on all guns from everyone. Then the NRA and the proponents of gun rights cite Second Amendment and personal defense. This debate gets heated up for a few weeks, and then our attention is turned elsewhere. Until another mass shooting happens. The true purposes of gun control in America, today on Powerhouse Tactical. In these debates, there is a group of folks that often get left out. The minority groups, especially the Black Americans. In order to really understand anything, one must look at and understand its history and where it comes from. So let's look at the gun control in America. It has been evolving throughout history of the United States. Most of us don't realize that there have been gun control laws and efforts in existence for a very, very long time. In fact, there were gun laws in 1600s. More than 100 years before America was even born. One may assume that when the United States of America was founded, especially with the Second Amendment, they would have done away with the whole gun control thing. Well, you'd be wrong. There have been countless laws and regulations regarding firearms in America, going even as far as to ban certain firearms from certain groups of people. Let's look at the motivation of gun control in 1800s. 1854 to be exact. Then the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, wrote a grave warning into the heart of Dred Scott decision. If blacks were permitted to become citizens, Taney warned, they, like whites, would have full liberty to keep and carry arms wherever they went. Of course, thank God for all of us, the slavery ended anyway, and all races would become full citizens of the United States, eventually. The U.S. federal government's position in the 1800s was that the Second Amendment was limited to the actions of the federal government. Therefore, any restrictions put on its people by individual state government or even local governments were not a violation of Second Amendment. This is an argument used even to this day by some of the gun control advocates. We'll get back to that in a bit. So as a libertarian-leaning conservative, I strongly believe that each individual state's rights should not be infringed by the federal government's overreach. So I actually don't have quite a bit of a problem with this particular decision's essence, at least. However, there are some matters that most of us will agree that the federal government should step in for and make sure that the states are not committing certain atrocities such as slavery or certain other human rights violations, and obviously for national security issues. With that said, let's look at what the states were doing at the time. For example, a famous town, Dodge City, Kansas, had formed its municipal government for the first time in 1878. The very first law that they passed as a newly formed town was to prohibit carrying of firearms in public. This was an economically motivated decision, though. As a new town, they wanted to attract more people. More influential people to invest there, to move there with their families. Sounds pretty good. Sure, unless you were a formerly slave black American. It had been over a decade since all slaves were freed in America, which triggered the great wave of freedom all around the world, which eventually rooted all slavery on earth, which I am very proud to be an American for. However, now free, blacks were economically poor with high illiteracy rate, living in areas that law enforcement were scarce. So the while unarmed citizens in Dodge City were enjoying their mandated peace and protection provided by its great law enforcement, blacks were not the case. They were not provided with such protection, while they were still subjected to the same weapons ban as everyone else, leaving them defenseless. This was hardly a limited case to Dodge City. Many regions of the country had various versions of gun control laws that the black Americans were clearly being targeted and discriminated against. Having to pay a fee for a license to own a gun, or only people who owned a property may purchase firearms, were clearly discriminatory against the disproportionately poor blacks. Some areas didn't even try to hide this type of discrimination when they required a literacy test to vote, or even only allowing people who served in the Confederate Army can purchase firearms. As unbelievable as it sounds, these were actual laws in the books, and they were way too many. Well, that was like 150 years ago, dude, you might say. Well, let's look at what happens in the 20th century. The very first national gun control law was passed in 1934, banning many types of firearms and carrying in certain areas. This was FDR's answer to famous Valentine's Day massacre. While this sounded like a good idea at the time, limiting mobsters from having too many guns and guns that were too powerful, such as fully automatic machine guns, placing a $200 tax on many of the firearm types, $200 in 1930s money, pretty much eliminated the chance of purchasing these guns for most black Americans at the time. Most of the mobster type criminals were not affected as much though, obviously due to being able to afford the ridiculous tax on these guns, many of them, or by just acquiring them through non-legal means. This took away the blacks' right to protect themselves with the new tax, just like their right to vote was taken away through the poll tax. They just made it unaffordable. 5 years later, in 1939, the U.S. government banned any interstate selling of short-barreled shotguns, citing that these were of no consequence to preserving the well-regulated militia. Therefore, sawed-off shotguns weren't protected under the Second Amendment. This was the beginning of government deciding what is appropriate and reasonable for its citizens to own and carry. This alone, we may be able to argue that it's unconstitutional. Then in the 1960s, this famous civil rights era, the civil rights leaders clearly expressed the need for self-defense. In fact, even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had applied for the permit to carry a firearm in public and was unsurprisingly denied. In 1967, in California, 30 armed members of Black Panthers Party walked into the state capitol, citing the California Penal Code, allowing law-abiding citizens, non-criminal, law-abiding citizens, to be able to arm and protect themselves in public, anywhere, any public place. Shortly after that, the Mumford Act was passed, prohibiting carrying of firearms in public. 1 year later, Gun Control Act of 1968 was signed into law by federal government, banning guns known as Saturday night specials, meaning guns that people of low economic status could afford were being banned by the new law. Needless to say, the people under poverty at the time were disproportionately black Americans. These trends continue today. We are just less in your face about the whole racist part of it. Even today, most states require licensing and mandatory training to own or carrying of firearms at very high costs, not to mention the high taxes and fees to purchase firearms, citing coined terms like public safety, common sense laws, and save the children. What they actually are doing is to make guns more expensive to own, more hassle. This does not make anyone any safer. It only continues to keep guns out of the hands of law-abiding people, especially Black Americans. In 2010, Mr. Otis McDonald, a 76-year-old black man in Chicago, sued the city of Chicago for prohibiting him from owning a firearm. In the neighborhood that Mr. McDonald lived in weren't the nicest neighborhoods. And he sincerely felt the need to protect himself and his community, especially with lack of law enforcement in the area at the time. He is, in my opinion, a civil rights leader, not a gun rights advocate. The U.S. Supreme Court, thank God, ruled 5-4 that the Second Amendment applied here to all citizens and states as well. Contrary to the ruling of the 1800s, U.S. Supreme Court decided that even state governments weren't allowed to infringe on the individual citizen's right to take arms. The city of Chicago must let Mr. Otis McDonald own firearms to protect himself. So he does now. Liberals go further today to depict gun ownership as an exclusively white thing, causing a certain stereotype in the minds of minorities to be for the whole gun control movement. In 2009, Contessa Brewer of MSNBC had falsely reported a gun-toting man at an anti-Obamacare rally as a racist white man who was angry that a black man was in the White House. Well, what they edited out was the gun owner's face and hands. You know why they did that? Because he was actually a black man himself. It is time that the minority communities in America, especially Black Americans, needs to look at this so-called gun control movement and see it for what it is. A race control attempt. They have gone away from creating laws to stop blacks and other minorities from arming themselves, exercising their constitutional, God-given, unalienable rights. It is no longer politically correct to do that, citing race. So now they have gone out of their way to make gun ownership a racist thing. Only the racist white men own guns. As ridiculous as it sounds now, think about it. That's what you see on the media. The good news is, though, that at the present time, under the Trump presidency, we are seeing a sharp increase in legal gun ownership in the Black American communities and other minority communities as well. The legal gun ownership means not only the obvious empowerment and self-protection that it brings, but also a much higher level of self-responsibility that comes with it. Having more legally armed citizens that are more conscious and more responsible in any community makes that community that much safer. It is time that all Americans, white, black, brown, yellow, red, and even purple, regardless of color of their skin or religion, to remember that the Constitution and all of the amendments that are in it does not grant us any of those rights, but to protect those rights that were given to us by our Creator. And they protect those rights for us from being infringed upon by our government. Thank you for listening.